The hormonal control of metabolism is an integration of neuroendocrine function. The endocrine system is a set of glands and cells that pass signals to the body to elicit a response. This is an overview of the endocrine system with the major endocrine glands listed on the left, the ones that we are going to be focusing on. The hypothalamus, the pituitary, the thyroid, the adrenal glands, the pancreas, and the kidney. And then there are organs that contain endocrine cells, and the ones that we will talk about during these metabolism lectures are liver and kidney. But this specific talk is on the hypothalamus and pituitary organ axis. There are several hormones that are released by the hypothalamus that affect the pituitary, and then the pituitary will release hormones from that will then go to distant effector sites to either increase the release of other hormones or inhibits its own release of hormones to regulate systemic functions. And the hypothalamus pituitary organ axis is very important in the regulation of metabolism and many other things. So the hypothalamus is a part of the central nervous system, and it integrates many inputs: thermoregulation, appetite, arousal. There are many inputs, and then this allows it to control the body through the release of hormones via the anterior pituitary. So the hypothalamus will get inputs, and then it can express the response of that by sending hormones down to both the anterior and the posterior pituitary to regulate function. The functions of the anterior and posterior pituitary are slightly different. We have the anterior pituitary here that is connected to the hypothalamus via this portal capillary bed system, and then you have the posterior pituitary that's connected via these nerves that go down to this capillary bed. The main difference between the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary function is that the hypothalamus creates hormones and passes it down this capillary bed to the anterior pituitary that will then either stimulate or inhibit the formation of other hormones in the anterior pituitary and stimulates their release. Whereas with the posterior pituitary, you have hormones that are made up here and are just passed down and then released by the posterior pituitary. So the anterior pituitary is much more metabolically active than the posterior pituitary. So looking at the hormones that are released by the hypothalamus and that affect the anterior pituitary, they're listed here. You have thyrotropin releasing hormone that's released by the hypothalamus and will pass down to the anterior pituitary, and this will then stimulate the release of thyrotropin or TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. You have gonadotropin releasing hormone that's involved in reproduction, and that stimulates LH and FSH. And then corticotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus stimulates the release of adrenocorticotropin hormone that's important in the release of cortisol, and we'll be talking about that in the relevant lecture. Then growth hormone releasing hormone will stimulate growth hormone release, and then somatostatin, or growth hormone inhibitory hormone, functions to inhibit the release of growth hormone. And so we can see here that the hypothalamus has mechanisms to both increase and decrease the release of certain hormones. And then prolactin factor, that's necessary for releasing prolactin that's involved in feeding newlyborns. And they are, again, both inhibitory and stimulatory functions to the hormones released by the hypothalamus. This is a histology slide from Dr. Al Ghul looking at the anterior pituitary. There are two basic types of cells, of basophils that will release TSH and ACTH, and then acidophiles that release growth hormone and prolactin. And there are different amounts of these cells in the anterior pituitary. Most of them are somatotrophs that release growth hormone, but this graph shows you the relative abundance of those, and also these numbers are the molecular sizes of the proteins that are released, the hormones that are released. And so we've talked about the anterior pituitary, how it is at the bottom of this portal bed system, and then the posterior pituitary releases vasopressin and oxytocin, and it functions as a neuroendocrine gland, and it's connected to the hypothalamus through this pituitary stalk, or it is also called an infundibular stalk or infundibulum. ADH is involved in maintaining body fluid osmolality, and oxytocin is involved in reproductive functions. And like I say, it doesn't synthesize the release of these hormones. These are passed down through these cell bodies and then released into the systemic circulation. And this is just a summary of the main hormones that are released from the anterior pituitary. You have growth hormone that stimulates the release of insulin-like growth factor, which stimulates growth in almost all parts of the body, and it participates in the control of metabolism by being able to increase glucose through lipolysis. And then prolactin and follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, these are involved in reproduction and feeding in postpartum. And then adrenocorticotrophin hormone stimulates the release of cortisol from the adrenal cortex, and thyroid-stimulating hormone will stimulate the release of thyroid hormone from the thyroid glands. And both of these have important metabolic functions. This is a histology slide of the posterior pituitary, and oxytocin and ADH are then released from these brown herring bodies. And this is a summary of what they do. Vasopressin or ADH, it regulates body fluid osmolality, and oxytocin then is involved in reproductive functions. It's important to note that there are feedback mechanisms, negative feedback mechanisms to this hypothalamus pituitary organ axis, and they are of varying lengths. So the hypothalamus releases hormones that act on the anterior pituitary, but these hormones themselves can feed back onto the hypothalamus to inhibit the release of itself. And then also the anterior pituitary will release hormones, and these feed back on the hypothalamus to prevent the release of the initial hormone. And then you have long loop, which is when the distant effector organ releases a substance that inhibits both the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus. So taking the example of cortisol, CRH is released, and in the ultra short loop it feeds back to the hypothalamus and inhibits its own release. Then from the anterior pituitary, CRH will stimulate ACTH, sorry, and that through the short loop feedback inhibits the release of CRH from the hypothalamus. And then ACTH then releases cortisol from the adrenal cortex, and via long loop feedback it inhibits the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus. And so what this does is prevent an over stimulation of release, effective control, and a pulsatile pattern of hormone release. And it's important to remember that sometimes the ultra short loop and the short loop are not found, depending on which hormones we're talking about.